Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's so nice to see all of your beautiful faces. We're going to go very swiftly today. We have a lot to cover, but we have a very, very wonderful speaker to help us introduce the whole story of Menachem Begin. She was his secretary. My birds they want to join in. I hope you don't mind. So Ariela Cotler, she's known for being a dedicated and passionate member of Montreal's Jewish community with an affinity for Jewish studies, Ethiopian Jewry, and neuroscience. She was the secretary to the former Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. So it's my pleasure, my honor to introduce Ariela Cotler, wife of the former Justice Minister of Canada, and she is now the national president of Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. And so we would love to hear from her perspective, her impressions about her hero, Menachem Begin, for whom she was secretary. Ariela.
Yeah, so first of all, Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov to everybody. I thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today about really one of Jewish modern heroes, a leader and a mensch, a man of morality and dignity and truth and love that is so missing in today's world and in Israel too. Just to a slight correction, I was not Menachem Begin's personal secretary. There was one man that can answer and was entitled to answer this exact title, and his name was Yechiel Kadishai, who followed Menachem Begin from the underground all his life to the last day of his life. And I don't want to take Yechiel Kadishai's title from him. He was forever Menachem Begin's personal assistant and secretary. I was a parliamentary secretary, a relatively young person when I entered Knesset accidentally at the end of the 6 Days War to replace Yechiel Kadishai very temporarily, which lasted exactly 13 years, a little bit over 13 years. But Yechiel remained the one and only. I was a parliamentary secretary, a legislative assistant to the Gachal party, to Menachem Begin personally, and later on, at the beginning of his being a prime minister for a short while until I left my job and moved to Canada. You're going to hear, and because it's the 30th anniversary since Begin's passing, you're going to hear a lot about Menachem Begin, or heard a lot already about the personality and the leadership and the real impact that Menachem Begin had on the Jewish world and in the world in general. So what I wanted to do, and you'll hear tonight from Rabbi Soloveitchik, which I am sure is going to be very, very inspiring and informative. He's an amazing speaker, and real spirituality will come out from his message today. So what I chose to do is actually look at two of the very core principles of Begin's legacy and look through the events that unfolded in his political life, some before my working directly with him, and some that I personally witnessed through the 13 years between 1967 and 1979, very important years in the history of the state of Israel, that I worked closely with Menachem Begin. So the two basic fundamental values that Menachem Begin espoused to as the product of the awakening of Europe was nationalism on the one side and liberalism on the other. Begin was the quintessential national liberal person or liberal nationalist leader. His role models, that many times you could hear him talk about, there were two Italian leaders, Mazzini and Garibaldi, that he quoted always, very frequently, as the model of liberal, democratic, nationalist leaders that created modern Italy, and Masaryk and Beneš, likewise, amazing leaders of the rebirth of Czechoslovakia at the middle and end of the 19th century as a model of liberal, democratic, nationalist leader that created basically those nations at the time of the awakening of nationalism in Europe at the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Spring of Nations. So those were Menachem Begin's model, Masaryk and Beneš, Mazzini and Garibaldi, but of course, over and above, his personal teacher, Ze'ev Jabotinsky. So I would like to look at those values of national liberalism, לאומיות ליברלית, that was Begin's core value, and see how it reflected his political life from the beginning to the end. So first of all, I wanted to look at nationalism. Begin believed, obviously, that the Jewish peoplehood is a peoplehood, not only a religion. And being a people, it is a nation that deserves its own state, independence, sovereignty, and back at his historical homeland, the state of Israel. Zionist, nationalist views. The other part of it was his liberal views that the state in and of itself is a value, but it was created for the individual. As Ze'ev Jabotinsky taught him, Bereshit bara Elohim et hayachid. First, God created the individual. So the state is not, although it's important and although you have to fight for it, and that is the nationalistic part of Menachem Begin's vision, not less and maybe more important. The state is there created to serve the individual. Basically, here you get the liberal views of the place of the state in the life of the individual, while the state is in and of itself a value. When Begin created his political movement, no wonder he gave it the name Tnuat HaCherut, the movement of freedom. And the four principles of Tnuat HaCherut, of which I was a member from very young age, the four principles of Tnuat HaCherut were really what Begin struggled for and fought for all his life. It was Shlemut HaMoledet, the wholeness, integrity of the state, Kibbutz Galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Here is the nationalistic part, the two legs of the four legs of the fundamental DNA of the Cherut party, the wholeness of the state, the gathering of the exile, and the other two legs are Tzedek Chevrati, social justice, and Cherut Adam, the freedom, human rights of the individual. So you can see from these four values how Begin directed his life on four legs that had two and two, nationalism and liberalism, state and individual. And that basically really followed his life from the beginning to end. And I wanted to share with you some of the things that Begin acted upon with these four principles from the very beginning of his political involvement in the Knesset from the 50s, at which point I was not yet working directly with him, but I can give you illustrations of how deep these individual rights and integrity of the land were part of his life. For instance, he fought, although we know that he belonged to the right wing, and people might assume that Arab citizens' rights were not up and above his values. He was the one member of parliament that fought continuously for the eradicating of the military control, the Meshal Tzva'i, the military rule over Israeli Arabs after the War of Independence. One might think that that would be antithesis to Menachem Begin's life and war, but no, he fought from the very beginning for Bitul HaMemshal HaTzva'i, the eradicating of the military control of the Israeli Arabs. The other thing he fought for and against was administrative detention. There was one very well-known story about a member of parliament that was the extreme opposite to Begin's views, Uri Avneri. It was a journalist and extreme on the other side of the political spectrum. The head of the Shabak came to Menachem Begin one day and told him that they are going to administratively detain Uri Avneri as a Soviet spy. And Menachem Begin said, absolutely, I will fight you everywhere I can. There will not be administrative detention in the Jewish state. If he is criminal, there will be a court, because the judiciary is over and above. There will be a court that will try a person, but not administrative detentions. So those are the two principles that we can see how the core values of his liberalism and nationalism worked together. But I want to move fast to stories that I personally witnessed. I became the parliamentary secretary for Gachal at the time. It was not called Likud, right at the end of the 6 Days War. And why? Towards the end of the waiting period for the beginning of the 6 Days War, like 2 weeks heading to the war, the tension in the state of Israel was at the highest level. If you will go today to any newspaper for the 2 weeks leading to June 6th of 1967, you will read headline after headline about the second Holocaust, about the danger to the survival of the Jewish state, how the Arabs are going to throw us all to the ocean and Israel will stop to exist, etc., etc. That was the feeling. And I recall, as a young soldier in the army of Israel at the time, the fear of actual disaster coming upon us. Menachem Begin was at the time the leader of the opposition. But because the security and the safety and the nationalist values were so strong and upmost in his mind, it was not a political gain or loss. It was not a personal partisan gain or loss. It was a national safety and security. Menachem Begin, and it's a story that is not told, and it's very typical that some of the stories that I'll tell you are not very well known and not particularly told. Why? Because Menachem Begin wanted to achieve the goal and did not worry about getting the credit for what he did or not getting the credit. Menachem Begin went at the time to the Minister of Interior, Yosef Burg, and asked him to go to Eshkol. Levi Eshkol was the prime minister at the time, and ask him to invite David Ben-Gurion, that left Mapai at the time and created a different party, invite him to his cabinet in order to allow Moshe Dayan to become the Minister of Defense, to bring up a little bit the morale of the people, to get a little bit of a sense of safety and security by having Moshe Dayan as a hero to become the Minister of Defense. Yosef Burg was the Minister of Interior at the time, went to Eshkol and offered him the suggestion to invite Ben-Gurion to his cabinet so that Moshe Dayan will become the Minister of Defense. Eshkol said, he said it in Yiddish, which I will not repeat, these two horses will not pull this wagon ever again. There was a big, big rift and anger between Eshkol and Ben-Gurion. And Eshkol said, I'm willing to quit as a prime minister. Let Ben-Gurion become a prime minister, but I will not work with him. Burg comes back to Begin and he tells him what Eshkol said. Now, Begin wanted a unity coalition. He believed that it will be important for the morale of the people. So he told Burg, you know what, go to Ben-Gurion and tell him to allow Dayan to join Eshkol's cabinet as a minister of defense. Burg said, you want me to go to Ben-Gurion and tell him that he is not wanted? That's what you expect me to do? I am not going. Now you have to remember, from 1948 until these days, Ben-Gurion could not bring out of his mouth the name Menachem Begin. He called him the man who sits to the right of Dr. Bader. He hated him. He couldn't say Chaver HaKnesset Menachem Begin. He couldn't utter the name. Menachem Begin, the hated man by Ben-Gurion, goes to Ben-Gurion himself. And Paula Ben-Gurion actually tried to stop him. He goes and he is asking Ben-Gurion to do what Burg refused to do, allow Moshe Dayan to become the Minister of Defense. It happened. For himself, Menachem Begin said, I don't want anything. I want to join this government as a minister without portfolio, just to sit at the security cabinet to be involved in the decision-making for the war. That's all. And that's how the Jewish people had, in the very hard days leading to the 6 Days War, and subsequently a unity coalition of a kind that never happened before or after. A unity coalition that really worked to bring together the people in the hardest times leading to a war. That was Menachem Begin looking not at the partisan, not at the personal, but at the national. Another anecdote around the 6 Days War, which is etched in my head. As the war was about to be over and the ceasefire was to be declared, Menachem Begin goes to another minister in Ben-Gurion, in Eshkol's government, Yigal Allon, a wonderful, wonderful person. And he says to him, we have to go to Eshkol and convince him to take the old city before the ceasefire starts. It can be a cry for generations if we'll miss the opportunity to take back the old city of Jerusalem. They both go to Eshkol. Begin did not want to go alone. He thought that with Yigal Allon it will be more powerful because they were of the same party. And Eshkol said, I can't do that. Dayan is not here. Dayan is at the Matkal in Tel Aviv. If not for Begin's pushing at the last minute, like 5 minutes to 12 before ceasefire, to allow Mota Gur to enter the old city, the war would have ended without the old city, Temple Mount, and the Kotel back in Jewish hands. That was Menachem Begin, the nationalist. That was Menachem Begin that believed in the history and the historical rights of the Jewish people. He stayed in this government even after Eshkol died and Golda Meir became a prime minister. I will tell you why Menachem Begin left this government. In August of 1970, Golda Meir signed an agreement. It's called the Rogers Agreement. In this agreement, Golda Meir basically gave the most important assets of the Sinai Desert back to Sadat. The Gidi and the Mitle Pass, the oil field, all the basic important part of the Sinai Desert were given. The ink did not dry on this agreement yet, and Sadat moves Soviet anti-aircraft missiles on the other side of the Suez Canal into Sinai. Begin, a minister in Golda Meir's government, goes to her and he says, I urge you to go and demand from the Americans that they will put pressure on Sadat, remove those missiles back to the other side. Because when the next war, not if, when the next war will break out, our planes will fall like flies. And I remember in the session in the Knesset in August of 1970, Begin announcing that he is quitting that cabinet and telling in public, when the next war will break out, not if, but when, for sure it will, our planes will fall like flies if these missiles are not going to be removed to the other side. Golda did not request the removal. 3 years later, just a little bit over 3 years later, in October of 1973, the Yom Kippur War began. And the missiles that were moved in 1970 after the Rogers Agreement from one side of the Suez Canal to the Sinai Desert shot down our planes one by one. The security and the well-being and the safety of the state were over and above in his mind when he entered the government, over and above on his mind when he left that government. But before the Yom Kippur War, he did not attack this government. He only begged Golda Meir on the Thursday before the war started to come to the National Security Parliamentary Committee to report about the military movement of the Egyptian and the Syrian military towards Israel's border. She did not. The war erupted. We suffered casualties of unbelievable numbers. Thousands of boys got killed. Thousands more were wounded. Not one word uttered against this government. We were going to go for an election in November of 73. Many of his friends told him, this government did a horrible thing, we need to attack it. There will be an election, this government has to go. You know what was his answer? Not a word until the last soldier gets home. Only when the war was over, only then, Menachem Begin stood on the Knesset podium with tears in his eyes. And he said, we asked you, we begged you, why didn't you move the tanks? Why didn't you call the reserves? Did not attack while the war was going on. Did not make any political partisan gains because the nation, mamlachtiyut, the well-being of the people, its security and safety were on top of his personal political partisan needs. That's on the national side. On the liberal human rights, individual rights, Menachem Begin adapted and adopted we call it Chameshet HaMemim, the 5 mem, the letter mem that starts 5 words that Jabotinsky designed for a democratic, pluralistic, individual rights, human rights respecting country. In Hebrew, it goes Mazon, Malbush, More, Ma'on, Marpeh, standing for Mazon, food, Malbush, clothing, More, education, Ma'on, housing, and Marpeh, medical services. The 5 essential values and needs that the country must provide to all its citizens. And therefore, not surprisingly, while in opposition, Menachem Begin was fighting, the #1 fighter for equal rights. For him, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, new immigrants, old immigrants, their rights were equal, and the war for the equal rights was a paramount for anything. I can tell you that when Avital Sharansky came to Israel in 1974, fighting for the release of her husband, for Begin, it was not Natan Sharansky. For Begin, it was the value of the ingathering of the exiles. He fought endlessly on behalf of Soviet Jewry. And I can tell you that when Avital Sharansky would come to the Knesset, it was Menachem Begin's petit cash that was very petit. He was not a rich man, that paid from his personal salary for many, many, many of the phone calls, long distance. It was very expensive in 74, 5, 6, and 7, very, very expensive. We paid for the calls that Avital did to all leaders throughout the world, because the gathering of the exiles, Sharansky is a typical prototype of Soviet Jewry that we had to fight for ingathering. So you see the individual rights and you see the national rights. You see the liberal freedoms and you see the security and safety of the states playing together hand in hand. All that while he was in opposition until 1977. Now, Menachem Begin was a leader of the opposition from 1948, 49 until 1977, fighting from the opposition for Israel, for its citizens, defending the government outside of Israel. He never criticized if he was invited by Bonds or by Federation or by any other organization to talk, never criticized the government of Israel abroad, never criticized the government of Israel abroad, because it wasn't done. He did not receive the same treatment when he was a prime minister. But how interesting it is that in 1977, in May of 1977, when Begin was elected as a prime minister, what were his first decisions? What were the first thing he did? One, he brought the boat people. People were drifting away in Vietnam, in the war in Vietnam, dying in the waters, and he decided as a humanitarian gesture, bring refugees to Israel from the boat people. Then the other social justice thing, he created the program of Shikum Shchunot, Project Renewal. Why? Because the underprivileged neighborhoods and towns in Israel suffered for years, underprivileged in the full sense for years, in building, in housing, in education. The first decision he made, and he approached the entire Jewish world, Montreal was very active in few of those projects, Project Renewal, adopt an underprivileged town or city, help it build itself from housing to education, to sports, to culture, everything that the community deserves and needs and was not receiving over the years. He did these two things, and parallel to that, that is on the social justice, liberal life. On the other side, the national working for peace. One of the first announcements he made is peace is uppermost on his mind, to bring upon peace with the Arab world. Now, the first leader that picked up the message that Menachem Begin is going to do everything for peace was obviously Anwar Sadat of Egypt. We all remember his earth-breaking, unbelievable, mind-boggling visit to Israel in 1977, working towards peace. To this day, we know that the peace treaty with Egypt held with a very heavy price, giving up the entire Sinai. Begin was heavily criticized for that. Sandra, you have to tell me if I'm overstepping my 20 minutes. He knew that he's going to be criticized heavily, giving up the entire Sinai. But he also knew that when he actually drafted United Nations Resolution 242 in 1967, the purpose was a long and lasting peace and the securing of Eretz Israel. In his vision, Sinai was not part of Eretz Israel. Yehuda v'Shomron, Jerusalem, and Ramat Golan were the biblical Jewish state. Mm-hmm. Sinai was not. So he went over and above towards Sadat in Camp David. I was there with him and I know the agony he went through deciding about the removal of settlements in Gaza and in Yamit. Real physical pain to decide to remove Yamit from the ground. It was either doing that or not signing the peace treaty. Now that is considered today, and actually April 21st, 1982 was the removal of Yamit. So we're now actually commemorating the 40th anniversary for this milestone, very painful milestone in the life of Menachem Begin and in the history of peace for Israel. I know the pain because he promised the settlers of Yamit and other settlements there that there will not be one settlement removed, that they will stay. But Sadat had a sine qua non. Either you remove all or there will be no peace. With him in Camp David were two other ministers that were not from his political persuasion. One was Moshe Dayan, that he took in as a minister of defense, and the other one was Ezra Weizmann. They did not stand firm with Begin to insist that the settlements will not be removed. With great pain, he had to come to the Knesset and put it to the Knesset. Either we're signing the peace treaty with Egypt and destroying and removing all settlements from the Sinai desert, or this peace treaty with Egypt is not going to happen. It was a very difficult moment. I remember long nights of discussions. He was attacked by his own party members, some of the people that were friends of his from the underground, from the Etzel and the Lehi, attacked him, that he is betraying them, that he is sticking a knife in their heart by doing that because he's giving up Eretz Israel, and from the left, that he is removing settlements. He got attacked from both sides. It was one of the most difficult moments for Menachem Begin, the person. He did something that he did not want to do, but he believed that for the purpose of that peace, that is holding from 1982 with all the turmoils that the Middle East had gone through. The peace with Egypt, though called peace, is holding all these years. And that was Menachem Begin's leadership and decision to take on with pain against his own beliefs and do something that he believed from the bottom of his heart that is necessary. One, because it's not actually part of Eretz Israel, and he believed that once we'll move out of Sinai, because the United Nations resolution called for withdrawal from territories, but not from all the territories. Once we pulled out from the majority of the territories, we are going to be able to hold Yehuda, Shomron, Yerushalayim, and Ramat Golan. It did not exactly happen that way, and that's why the criticism on that move, even these days, even yesterday, people commemorating the destruction of Yamit from the very right are attacking him, that was a wrong move. Painful as it was, he did it. I wanted to just a little bit of Begin the person. When he was elected as the prime minister, he was asked, in what style would you rule the country? And he said, Besignon Yehudi Tov. בסגנון יהודי טוב, because he was fundamentally a good Jew that believed in Jewish values, that believed in democratic values, that believed in the safety and security of Israel above all, and believed in individual rights over and above the rights of the state. So I would like to close with two very, very last comments. When he was asked once, how would he want to be remembered? And he said, if I'll ever be remembered, I want to be remembered as a person that made sure that there will not be Milchemet Achim, a war between the Jewish people. And I have to tell you, he did that. He did that in the most difficult time during the underground, where the Haganah people were handing in the Etzel people into the hands of the British soldiers. And some of his dear friends told him that they have to take revenge. And he said no. And in the most difficult time of Altalena's story, when the boat was fired upon and it was full of weapons and people wanted to shoot back, and from the water, as he was thrown into the water and fired upon, he yelled from the water, no shooting back. Rak lo milchemet achim. And if you want to remember me by anything, this is it. And about his modesty, and about his humbleness, and about the way he conducted his life. Menachem Begin is the only one prime minister that left his job as a prime minister when he decided that he no longer can carry on the job. It was after his wife, my dear Aliza Begin, died. He was left attacked during the days and nights of the war in Lebanon, pained about every soldier that died, having demonstrators outside his window night in and night out, calling him a murderer. The police wanted to remove them from outside his home. The fence around Menachem Begin was shorter and narrower than the fences around our homes in Westmount. A simple fence. People were outside his window, literally outside his window, yelling every night, begging murderer, with Yortzeit candles, how many soldiers you killed today. The police said, we'll remove them. And he said, no. Demonstration is a fundamental civil right. They will demonstrate. And when he left, and he had to evacuate the home of the prime minister, my dear friends, Menachem Begin had nowhere to go. He had no home. He had no property. He lived in a rental place all his life until he became a prime minister. And when he became a prime minister and he moved to the prime minister's house, he gave back the key for the rented apartment. Now, what do you do with Menachem Begin? Where would he go? We rented a home for him, an apartment, small apartment. It was paid by him from his pension. Now, you know, we're looking at today leaders of the world. And I can tell you, I don't want anybody to be like Menachem Begin, because you cannot. We're living in a different world.
Yeah.
But how typical it is for this man that had lived this kind of a life to write the message to his beloved Yechiel Kadishai and say, upon my death, don't bury me in Har Herzl with all the other prime ministers and leaders of the Jewish people. Bury me in Har Zeitim, in Mount of Olives, near two soldiers, Feinstein and Barazani. And he said, one Iraqi, one Ashkenazi, one Etzel, one lechi, and as he said, lochamim, achim, Yehudim. For him, that was the most important. And therefore, if you go to Yerushalayim and you want to look for Menachem Begin's cemetery and burial place, you go to Har HaZitim, not to Har Herzl, and you'll find him right next to these two soldiers, one from the Etzel, one from the Lechi. I don't know if you know the story, but I'll tell you, because it is so typical of Begin's choice. Feinstein and Barazani were two soldiers that were supposed to be hanging by the British that morning for treason against the British. That morning that they were supposed to be hanged, they had a grenade smuggled to them from the outside by their friends in an orange. Their plan was to blow the orange with themselves so the British will not hang two Jewish soldiers, but the hanger will die with them. What spoiled the plan? The rabbi. The rabbi insisted to stay with the two boys to the last minute and do with them the prayer. Now, if they would keep their plan, they would kill the rabbi. And there was nothing they would want less than killing the rabbi. Feinstein lost already his arm in one of his battles. They hug each other with an arm. They put the grenade between their hearts and they blow themselves up. So the British will not have the pleasure of hanging two Jewish boys, but the rabbi will not get harmed. As a symbol of Jewish heroism in modern time, as a man that believed in the most highest level of mamlachtiyut, of Israel overall, but the individual and the rights of the people over the states, of fighting for integrity, fighting for democracy, for being a man of modesty and fair and nationalism and liberalism and beauty and love. How beautiful it is for him to have this simple request. Remember me as a person who requested to be buried with these two heroes. And there he lays in rest. I can tell you that some of the most incredible years of my life were those 13 years that I worked with and for Menachem Begin, a leader, a mensch, a leader that is missed today more than anything else and more than anywhere else in Israel's today. And I have to tell you that maybe one day, a special session and a special story has to be told also about his wonderful wife, Aliza Begin, that very little is known and very little is told about her. Her death in 1982, when he left government, was a very, very big part of his inability to continue. I know that you're going to hear more tonight about Menachem Begin. I wanted to share with you those moments of my personal involvement, of day by day working, how the values and what he talked about expressed themselves in the decision and in the running of the country, both as a leader of the opposition and later on as a prime minister. Thank you very much for listening.
Ariela, thank you so, so much. Perhaps you would give us a session on his beautiful wife. She had a lot of impact in her own way. Perhaps one day you will accept an invitation from us to expand on this part of Israel's history. And
I'd be very happy to do so.
Ariela, we cannot thank you enough for such a beautiful, deep insight into a part of our history that everybody needs to know. And perhaps you can ask Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University to take this lecture beyond just our little Zoom here. It's very important. I mean, there's a dearth of leadership everywhere in the world now. And your passionate story I'm going to share it far and wide. We need more of this, and God bless you. Thank you so much for joining us today. For everyone listening, Ariela's husband, Erwin Cotler, will be speaking at the Women's Learning Group's Yom HaAtzmaut session, which will take place next Tuesday. So just keep that in your calendar. God bless you, Ariela. Thank you for I love listening to you. It's always so ground zero. God bless you.
Thank you.
So now, Rabbi Soloveitchik, he needs very little introduction, but he joined Sharit Israel family of Spanish and Portuguese in New York in 2013. He's their 10th minister since the American Revolution. From the very start of his tenure, Rabbi Soloveitchik's sermons, public events, and classes have drawn enthusiastic crowds, and his beloved congregation has grown and flourished under his leadership. What can I say? Tikva Fund is the think tank who filmed this session. Tikva is propping him up as the next up-and-coming Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory. And so without further ado, Ronnie Gare, please let's watch the film on his hero too, Menachem Begin.
Menachem Begin first entered my mind and my imagination, looking like a Haredi Jew. I was a teenager and I had acquired a copy of Begin's memoir, The Revolt. And as one does, I began by looking at the photographs that occupied the center of the volume. There I saw a photograph of Begin bedecked in a black hat with a long beard, a rabbi looking out at me. This because when Begin arrived in Mandate Palestine in the early 40s, he took on the leadership of the underground organization known colloquially as the Irgun, and speedily became the most wanted man in the British Mandate. As an alias, Begin became Yisrael Halperin in Petach Tikva, and then he grew a beard, moved to Tel Aviv, and became Yisrael Sassover, known in the neighborhood as a very pious man and a regular worshiper in the local shul in the synagogue. He writes in his memoir as follows, quote, "My beard and the status conferred on me also imposed certain obligations in my new surroundings. On the very first day, I was asked by Reb Simcha, the genial beadle, that's the Gabbai or Shamish of the nearby synagogue, to come along and make up the quorum at prayers in a house where a death had taken place. Immediately thereafter, I was invited to become a regular participant in prayers in the synagogue." Begin further tells us that, quote, "I used to attend regularly the lessons in Talmud and biblical commentaries given every Sabbath afternoon by the rabbi. And also," he writes, that, quote, "that gave me my regular place, and thenceforth I became one of them." Begin also adds, in perhaps the most humorous part of what is by and large a very serious book, that, quote, "I heard later in confidence that if the British had remained in Eretz Yisrael 10 years longer, I might possibly have risen to high eminence and been elected second assistant to the third warden of the synagogue." Now, ladies and gentlemen, suffice it to say that if, say, Moshe Dayan or Yitzhak Rabin or some other young Israeli had sought to seamlessly fit into the Orthodox community in Tel Aviv, I don't think they could have pulled it off. And the same could be said for Begin's Zionist inspiration, Zev Jabotinsky. Begin's fluidity with Jewish ritual actually almost got him into trouble. He recounted to Yehuda Avner the first Shabbat in his shtibel in the Hasidic quarter near Petach Tikva, in his shul. He told Avner that, quote, "On the first Shabbat they honored me as befits a newcomer by calling me up to the reading of the Torah. The Gabbai asked who he was. Believe it or not, he said, with a chuckle and a cheeky smile, I stumbled. He hesitated, in other words." According to the story, Yehuda Avner describes how Begin told him that the Gabbai gave him a suspicious stare. After all, who doesn't know how to identify himself? But Begin was instinctively going to respond with his Hebrew name, Menachem ben Zev Dov, which you give when you are called up to read to the Torah, as you do whenever you're a newcomer to a shtetl. And Begin said to Yehud Avner, I had to remember not to give him my real name, but my Irgun name, not Menachem, but Yisrael. After that, I was always called to the Torah by that assumed name, and to this day, Begin concluded, I crave the Almighty's forgiveness for this deliberate misrepresentation in a holy place. There is in truth, I think, something fitting that my first image of Menachem Begin is as Yisrael Sassover, because that story and that identity testifies to his roots, to the city of his birth, which binds me to him, Brest-Litovsk, or as it was and is known to Jews, Brisk. There, in the Jewish community, Menachem Begin was taught Zionism by his parents. There he first heard Jabotinsky speak, spurring him to become ultimately the leader of the revisionist Zionist youth movement Beitar in Poland, and ultimately the leader of the revolt against the British. And it was in Brisk that the Nazis would murder his family, and so many others that he held dear. But Begin's life as Yisrael Sassover was not entirely an alias, because Brisk was also where he was taught in his home, in his synagogue, by his friends and classmates, the virtues of the past, love of Judaism, and a covenantal connection to the generations gone by, and ultimately a reverence for the Torah and for faith itself. At a ceremony convened in 1972 by descendants of Brisk, 30 years to the day after the destruction of their city by the Nazis, Begin eulogized his childhood home by remembering how proud he and his fellow denizens were to be known as Briskers. He said that Kulanu hitga'inu bekach, sheyesh la ha'ir Brisk delita historia. We were also proud that this city Brisk of Lithuania had a history. Geonim adirei Torah, giants of Torah. Mi me'itanu, he said, who amongst us, lo ra'at atzmo, did not see himself, ki'ilu haya shutaf l'Rav Yoshe Ber l'Reb Chaim Ke, ki'ilu anachnu hayinu imam kol yemei chayinu. Who did not see ourselves as if they were partners to the rabbinic leaders of Brisk, to Rabbi Yoshe Ber and to Rabbi Chaim, as if we were with them all the days of our life. And here Begin is making reference to my ancestors, Rabbi Joseph Ber and Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, leaders of the community of Brisk, known for their Talmudic brilliance. Rabbi Chaim himself was renowned for creating a way of studying Talmud for which Begin's hometown would be forever known within Orthodoxy, the Brisker method. These rabbinic Soloveitchiks were also known for their opposition to Zionism, a source of tension between the Soloveitchiks and Begin's father, a leader of the Zionists in Brisk. So one might understand if, 30 years later in 1972, looking back on the memory of his murdered parents, Begin would have remembered the rabbinic leadership with some bitterness. But no. For him, the Soloveitchiks are a source of pride. Indeed, he says that he considers himself a shutaf, a partner to their lives. Disagreeing with his childhood rabbis does not mean rejecting all that they embodied. On the contrary, he reveres them, he feels bound to them. And I, in turn, feel bound to Begin, my Brisker landsman. Menachem Begin is my hero, the man I believe to be the greatest Jewish statesman of the last many centuries. By this, I do not mean to say that he is the most important figure in the birth of the State of Israel. That honor would go to Herzl and then to Ben Gurion. Nor do I mean that he is the greatest statesman in recent history. Surely Lincoln and Churchill are claimants to that title. Nor do I mean that he is the greatest embodiment of living Judaism. That honor would go to specific rabbis I have in mind. But I do believe that Begin was the greatest Jewish statesman in a very long time. And by this I mean that no other individual so seamlessly combined the covenantal Jewish worldview of the past with his Zionist statesmanship in the present. And I believe that the key to this achievement, what set him apart from pretty much every other Zionist leader of his age, was his childhood home of Brisk. And Begin said so himself when asked if he would ever return to the city where his family and many, many thousands of Jews were murdered. He said, "No, I will not allow myself to go back to Brisk, yet Brisk will always follow me and be with me, because the three main things I have learnt were instilled in me in sorrow and also in joy, that I have carried with me from my childhood home, with me during the nights of conflict and the days of joy. Here they are. 1. Love your fellow Jews. 2. Do not fear the Gentiles. 3. Lucky is the man who carries the yoke of his childhood with him." Today, utilizing Begin's writings and speeches, as well as some of my own published reflections, drawing on some of my own published reflections about Begin in Mosaic and in commentary, I will reflect how these 3 lessons that he bore from Brisk defined his life, and why ultimately they should define ours. The first Brisker lesson: love your fellow Jews. This Begin did indeed do. One of the striking aspects of Begin's speech is that he really spoke to his audience as Israelis. He would always say, when he was speaking to Jewish Israelis, he would say Yehudim, meaning Jews, or as some translated correctly, fellow Jews. Thus, when he was accused in 1981 during the election season by Shimon Peres of planning the strike on the Osirak reactor in Iraq to spur his own electoral success, he said as follows to the assembled crowd. He said, "Yehudim, atem makirim oti 40 shana. Ani garti bepetach tikva b'shchunat Chasidov. Fellow Jews, you have known me for 40 years from when I lived in the Chasidov quarter of Petach Tikva. Do you think he said that I would risk the lives of pilots, leman bechirot, for elections?" And by the way, feel free to send me an email telling me how amazing my imitation of Menachem Begin is, because it is amazing. If you think it's not good, don't email me. That is the phrase he used, Yehudim. When he was elected in 1977 and asked Be'ez Signon in what style he would conduct his administration, he immediately responded, briefly and simply, B'signon Yehudi Tov, in the style of a good Jew. For Begin, central to his identity was being a Yehudi. And as my grandfather once homiletically said, we Jews nowadays, no matter what biblical tribe we may have come from, all call ourselves Yehudim, descendants of Judah, because it is Judah who originally united the Jewish people after the sin of the kidnapping of Joseph, when in Egypt he stood before the vizier that was his brother in disguise, and when the vizier sought to claim his baby brother Benjamin as his slave, Judah stepped forward and said, "Take me instead." To be a Yehudi is to be bound up in a familial faith in which we are responsible. By its very name, it implies responsibility for others and our boundedness with others. And this lay at the core of Menachem Begin's worldview. And we can find when this worldview matured and fully came to be. In his memoir, White Nights, describing his time spent in the Soviet prison of Lukishki, arrested for the quote-unquote crime of Zionism, Begin became friends with 2 Gentile cellmates who confessed to him that their deepest desire was that Germany attack the Soviet Union. Then they would be released to fight for Poland. And this is actually what happened in the end. Now, Begin also wanted to be released, but he knew what would happen if the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union. That multitudes of Jews and Jewish communities would be at the mercy of the Nazi hordes. And so Begin told them, quote, "I can't forget that in the event of a Russo-German war, more millions of Jews are likely to fall into the hands of Hitler. I am not praying," he said, "for a war between Germany and Russia." That's what he added at the end. He had a whole long discussion. And then Begin writes, "The reply of the prisoners was an explosion of wrath. What you have just said," one of them said, "is most characteristic. With you people, everything is decided according to one criterion: what is good for the Jews. Actually," this prisoner said, "I was told long ago that there is solidarity among all Jews, but you have given me confirmation that you people guard your solidarity under all circumstances, even in prison." Begin, hearing this, writes that he reflected at that moment as follows: "What was there for me to reply to their contentions? They both spoke of Jewish solidarity as if it were a crime, as if they were talking about a conspiracy, something evil. For heaven's sake," Begin wrote, "what have the Jews not done to prove that they do not stick together? The divisions among the Jews, the multiplicity of their parties and their trends are proverbial." And all, Begin concluded, all to no purpose. The fictitious Jewish solidarity exists and will always exist in the minds of others. And if this is the case, I asked myself, writes Begin, has the time not come to strip it of the slur of a crime, the accusation of a conspiracy? Is our fate not unique? And is it not common to all of us Jews? Has not the time come to convert Jewish solidarity from a Gentile myth into a Jewish reality? This was the core of Begin's being, solidarity with Jews around the world. The revolt against the British by Begin can only be understood in this context. It was launched not in the name of the Jews who were already in Mandate Palestine, but rather in the name of the Jews around the world that in Begin's view the British had betrayed. Begin believed that the doomed Jews of Europe were denied entry into Palestine by the British because their being stuck in Europe and their ultimate death in Europe served British purposes. This way, the British could fulfill their promise to provide some form of a home in the Middle East for Jews, as promised in the Balfour Declaration, without there being that many Jews to actually fill it. In their name, in the name of those Jews around the world who were betrayed, Begin launched, who he believed had been betrayed, Begin launched a revolution. Only if you believe that the Jews are one people and bound up with one another does Begin's argument for revolt actually become understandable. But if Begin believed in the unity of the Jewish people as a sacred principle against all else, the same could not be said for his political opponents. And that is what set the stage for his greatest achievement. In June of 1948, the Irgun ship known as the Altalena, which is a pen name used by Vladimir Jabotinsky, came ashore at Kfar Vitkin, bearing badly needed arms and ammunition for the fledgling Jewish state. A disagreement ensued between Begin and Ben-Gurion as to the allocation of the arms, with Begin asking that 20% be allocated for Irgun forces in Jerusalem. With the Israeli Defense Forces surrounding the ship, a boy assisting in the unloading of its cargo fretted that those who had just come ashore from the ship might be fired upon. Begin assured him that this was inconceivable, that whatever happened, Jews do not shoot at Jews, he said. And he was badly mistaken. A firefight broke out. The Altalena fled back to the Mediterranean, landing near what is now Tel Aviv's Frishman Beach on June 22nd, with Begin on board the boat. There, David Ben-Gurion ordered the ship shelled, and in the end, 16 members of the Irgun were killed. Standing on the ship while it's being fired upon, with his dear friends dying around him, Begin ordered those aboard the Altalena not to fire back, declaring Milchemet Achim Li'olam Lo, never a war between brothers. And after leaving the smoldering Altalena with much of its arms lost forever, Begin went on the radio and again ordered his seething followers not to seek revenge. In other words, after wrongly predicting that Jews would never shoot at Jews, Begin now enunciated an even more extraordinary principle. The Jews should not shoot at Jews, even when those other Jews were shooting at them. This, as I argued in an article and commentary, this, I think, ensured the existence of Israel. The survival of the newly born state was anything other than assured, and shooting back, however self-justified the self-defense might have been, would have torn the people apart. Yehuda Avner quotes Begin explaining his motivation. He said, 20 centuries ago, we faced the bitter experience of the destruction of our Second Temple, the destruction of our capital, Jerusalem. And why? Because of our senseless hatred of each other, a hatred that led to civil war and to our utter ruin, B'chiyah l'dorot, a weeping for generations. This, I believe, formed truly Israel as a nation. And herein, ladies and gentlemen, lies a lesson. Statesmen, leaders, great men of history are usually remembered for what they achieved, but often the greatest moments are found in what they chose not to do. George Washington was an extraordinary man, but his greatest achievement is, again, his refusal not to become king when he could have, resigning his commission. And this act was rightly understood by his enemy George III, who famously said, if Washington does that, if he just gives up power, then he will be the greatest man in the world. Similarly, Menachem Begin is rightly remembered for what he did. The Osirak strike, peace with Egypt, the rebellion against the British. Yet it is Begin's words on the Altalena, what he was asking his fellow Jews not to do. That was his greatest achievement. Begin himself, after retiring from political life, understood how central the Altalena was to his legacy, reflecting that he hoped to be remembered first and foremost for preventing civil war. This is an essential part of the founding of Israel. I've been criticized in the past by a historian whose work I greatly respect for referring to Menachem Begin as a founder of Israel. He was, according to this historian, too young for this title. But I do refer to Begin as a founder for several reasons, but first and foremost because Israel truly became a country at this moment. I consider it one of the most important moments in Israel's history. And it's therefore all the more tragic, as I argued in commentary, that precious little has been done to remember the events surrounding the Altalena. A small stone stands near Frishman Beach, bearing the names of the 16 dead, and emblazoned with Begin's declaration that never a war between brothers, Milchemet Achim Le'olam Lo. And nearby, bizarrely, is a cartoonish statue of Ben Gurion standing on his head, one of the more popular photo sites in Tel Aviv. As the Jerusalem Post notes, quote, it's likely that few of the people taking selfies with the old man realize that right behind it is the site of one of the seminal events of Israel's early history. There have been several memorials made, but not at the site, not prominent enough at the site where it occurred. And in the end, the truest memorial to the Altalena, albeit only an implicit one, can be found at the grave of Menachem Begin himself. Because unlike previous prime ministers who were buried on Mount Herzl, or Ben Gurion who chose to be interred on his farm in the Negev, Begin requested that he be buried on the Mount of Olives, next to the graves of Moshe Barzani and Meir Feinstein, two Jewish fighters who had blown up a grenade in a cell in 1947 right before they were about to be hung, embracing each other and dying together. I have visited those graves. I have visited those graves with reverence. But only this week did I learn another connection to Begin and to myself, which is that Meir Feinstein was born in the Old City, but his parents had made Aliyah from Brisk. They, too, were members of Begin's town, of Begin's community, and Begin's burial next to Meir Feinstein signaled his eternal connection between the world from which he came and the modern Israel that he helped create. But that is not the only reason why Begin sought to be buried there. For Begin, the fact that these two young men came from opposite ends of the earth, Barzani was an Iraqi Sephardi, Feinstein was an Ashkenazic Jew, and yet died in each other's arms, that embodied the fact that Jews are bound by blood, that too often that blood has been shed by our enemies, and that is why we must never shed it ourselves. And ultimately, that is why we must seek to love the Jewish people. This Begin made clear in 1981 in what is probably the greatest political speech ever given in Israel's electoral history. An Ashkenazi entertainer had referred to Begin's Sephardic supporters by an ethnic slur that meant riffraff, and he claimed that the Sephardic community served no heroic role in the IDF. Begin stood before his supporters, cited the tale of these two boys who had died together in British prison, the blood of their hearts joining one another. And he said, Feinstein haya mimotze Europei mashakorim Ashkenazi. Feinstein was an Ashkenazi Jew. Barzani haya Sephardi me Iraq. Barzani was a Sephardic Jew from Iraq. And then he looks at the crowd and says, Ashkenazi? Iraqi? Yehudim! Achim! Lochamim! Jews! Brothers! Warriors! This is lesson 1 from Brisk. Love the Jewish people. Then there is the second lesson, one he learned from his father. Do not fear the Gentiles. In May of 1981, during this election season, in a meeting with American Jews, Begin was asked what he thought the lesson of the Holocaust was. Part of his answer was as follows. He replied, First, if an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. Don't doubt him for a moment. Don't make light of it. Do all in your power to deny him the means of carrying out his satanic intent. Second, he said, when a Jew anywhere is threatened or under attack, do all in your power to come to his aid. Never pause to wonder what the world will think or say. The world, said Begin, the world will never pity slaughtered Jews. The world may not necessarily like the fighting Jew, but the world will have to take account of him. These American Jews speaking to Begin had no idea what Begin was planning when he said these words, and some 2 weeks later he would order one of the most audacious strikes in history on Osirak, preventing Saddam Hussein from acquiring nuclear weapons. Everyone, including the Reagan administration, criticized him at the time. Begin was indeed the fighting Jew, and the world certainly did not like him. As I described in this month's column and commentary, Time magazine helpfully informed its readership that the name Begin, quote, rhymes with Fagin. That's the anti-Semitic character in Oliver Twist. An American jury in 1981 was told repeatedly that they must choose between Reagan and Begin. But Begin, to paraphrase his own words, never paused to wonder what the world would say, and the world did indeed have to take account of him. Interestingly, Menachem Begin's greatest defender around this moment was, of all people, Bob Dylan, who, in 1983, toward the end of Begin's administration, penned a song called Neighborhood Bully, in which he sarcastically described how Israel is talked about by those who hate it. It happens to be the most Zionist song in the history of rock and roll. And here is what Dylan said, in part referring clearly to Osirak. Neighborhood bully just lives to survive. He's criticized and condemned for being alive. He's not supposed to fight back. He's supposed to have thick skin. He's supposed to lay down and die when his door is kicked in. He's the neighborhood bully. And then Dylan adds, he destroyed a bomb factory. Nobody was glad. The bombs were meant for him. He was supposed to feel bad. He's the neighborhood bully. And while I do an excellent Menachem Begin impression, I'm not even going to try a Bob Dylan impression, ladies and gentlemen. This song, Neighborhood Bully, is clearly about Israel, but it could be, in its defense of Israel, in its stalwart, sarcastic defense of Israel, it could be a song about Begin himself, because his enemies around the world denounced him as a neighborhood bully when he was anything but. And even in Israel, his political opponents saw a contradiction between the man who made war against the British on behalf of his people and the man who made peace with Egypt on behalf of his people. Right before Begin left for Oslo to receive the Nobel Prize following the Camp David Accords, Golda Meir caustically remarked that, quote, Begin did not deserve a Nobel Prize, he deserved an Oscar, meaning that it was all an act, that Begin, in her view, did not truly seek peace. But Begin, as Begin's deep insight, as he made clear at the Nobel, is the opposite, that this was not a contradiction in his character at all, that often it is strength on behalf of one's people that leads to peace. By the time Begin had arrived in Norway, Golda Meir had died, and Begin, gentleman as he always was, began by celebrating his predecessor, saying, I asked for permission to pay tribute to Golda Meir, a great leader and prime minister who strove with all her heart to achieve peace between Israel and her neighbors. And then Begin addressed the virtue for which he was being awarded, peace. It was the Jews, Begin noted, in Oslo, who first bestowed the very notion of peace upon the world. He said, the ancient Jewish people gave the world the vision of eternal peace, of universal disarmament, of abolishing the teaching and learning of war. Two prophets, Yeshayahu ben Amoz and Micha HaMorashti, having foreseen the spiritual unity of man under God with his word coming forth from Jerusalem, gave the nations of the world the following vision expressed in identical terms. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Begin then added his own small reflection on peace. He said, despite the tragedies and disappointments of the past, we must never forsake that vision, that human dream, that unshakable faith. Peace is the beauty of life. It is sunshine. It is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family. It is the advancement of man, the victory of a just cause, the triumph of truth. Peace, said Begin, is all these and more. Begin, of course, understood as he said those words that those assembled in Oslo at the auditorium did not necessarily see him as a man of peace. They saw him as a fighter. And he therefore reminded them implicitly of the fact that he, Begin, who had just said that peace is the smile of a child, the love of a mother, the joy of a father, the togetherness of a family, that he himself had had his own family destroyed, his father and mother murdered, and that the world had done nothing to stop it, and that this had taught him that at times evil had to be fought before peace was possible. He said, in part, quote, but in my generation, ladies and gentlemen, there was a time indescribable. 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, a number larger than many a nation in Europe, were dragged to a wanton death and slaughtered methodically in the heart of the civilized continent. Other than a few famous and unforgettable exceptions, he said, they were left alone to face the destroyer. At such a time, unheard of since the first generation, the hour struck to rise and fight for the dignity of man, for survival, for liberty, for every value of the human image a man has been endowed with by his Creator, for every known inalienable right he stands for and lives for. Indeed, Begin added, there are days when to fight for a cause so absolutely just is the highest human command. Norway has known such days, said Begin, and so have we. Only in honoring that command comes the regeneration of the concept of peace. End quote. Let it, however, be declared and known, he added, that fighters for freedom hate war. Begin was dismissed by Jews and non-Jews as a man of war. But what he showed in his life was that only a fighting Jew who loves the Jewish people and does not fear the Gentiles, that can be the one who is best able to ultimately, after fighting, seek peace with the world. So those are our first two lessons. Love the Jewish people. Do not fear the Gentiles. And finally, and most importantly, the third lesson of Brisk. Lucky is he who bears the yoke of his childhood with him. Those are the three lessons Begin said he learned from Brisk. From the moment of Israel's birth, Begin stressed that the values of Jewish tradition, the values that he imbibed in Brisk as a child, must be part of Israel's public life. And that Israel must do so because those Israeli Jews owed it to all the faithful Jews of the past who died, but whose spirits were very much present in that state, which embodied the fulfillment of their most ardent yearnings. Thus, one day after Ben Gurion declared independence, the next night after Shabbat, the leader of the Irgun emerged from hiding. Over the radio, he announced that the revolt was over, that his organization would become part of the National Army. And the radio address that he gave is noteworthy because of its contrast to the words of the Israeli declaration that were pronounced the previous day. Rather than eliding the existence of God, as the declaration did, Begin began his address with the traditional Shechianu, thanking God for allowing them to reach this momentous hour. Begin echoed the phrase Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, the intentionally ambiguous locution used in the declaration, but he enlarged it to acknowledge the Tzur Yisrael V'Goalo, the Rock of Israel and its Redeemer. And whereas Israel's declaration only cited the Holocaust as further proof of Israel's necessity, Begin spoke of his murdered family and community as beacons and pole stars who lived alongside those who now fought for the Jewish people's resurrection. Begin said, as I wrote in Mosaic, I call Begin's worldview Covenantal Zionism. And what I mean by that is that Begin melded Jabotinsky's worldview with an encompassing approach to Jewish history that differed profoundly from that of many other Zionist leaders. The covenant of Israel, Moses taught, embraces et asher yeshno po imanu hayom et asher eineno po imanu hayom, those who are here today and those who are not here today. One cannot live as a Jew if one is not in communion with past and posterity. And Menachem Begin rightly rejected the predilection of the labor Zionist elite for amputating 2,000 years of exilic existence from Israeli identity. Begin understood that the battle for Jewish independence must be waged with a feeling of gratitude to those who had come before, and especially to those who had been murdered, the Jews who died with dreams deferred. Thus Menachem Begin revered Zev Jabotinsky, and he even referred to him by the traditional Jewish term, Mori v'Rabbi, my master and teacher, and yet, in their approach to tradition, they were very different. Jabotinsky, in a famous letter to Ben Gurion about how much he desired a Jewish state, once wrote with what can charitably be described as a lack of reverence for the everyday traditions of diaspora Jews. Jabotinsky wrote, quote, I can vouch for there being a type of Zionist who doesn't care what kind of society our state will have. I'm that person. If I were to know that the only way to a state was via socialism, or even that this would hasten it by a generation, I'd welcome it. More than that, added Jabotinsky, give me a religiously orthodox state in which I would be forced to eat gefilte fish all day long, but only if there were no other way, and I'll take it. That's what he wrote. In other words, for Jabotinsky, to achieve Zionism's ultimate goals, he would even eat gefilte fish, but only as a last resort. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like for a moment just to add that as extraordinary as Jabotinsky was, I will never, ever forgive him for this outrageous attack on gefilte fish, which I very much enjoy. This magical fish that somehow, we know not how, swims in the sea and yet nevertheless manages to keep a carrot on its back and delights us at our weekly Kiddush. But in all seriousness, Begin revered Jabotinsky, and there is much about Jabotinsky to revere, but he could never have written these words. Indeed, when the man known as Yisrael Sassover had a baby, when his wife had a baby, Begin actually hosted a Kiddush at the shul, with the members of the Irgun, unbeknownst to the synagogue, being the ones who were the sponsors, who were providing the food. As he puts it in his memoir, quote, "We decided to do it as prescribed by tradition. On the Sabbath at the synagogue, I was overwhelmed with the warmth of congratulations, and I was deeply grateful to these good people who shared my joy in my isolation. The celebration," writes Begin, describing the Kiddush for his daughter, "the celebration went off splendidly. Everything had been prepared. The faithful underground had not forgotten even the sliced salt herring spiked on cocktail sticks. And everybody told me," Begin wrote, "that there had never been such a well-managed party in their synagogue. Thus did Yisrael Sassover, rightly, though unknown, the most wanted man in the entire country, host a Kiddush at the shul for his daughter, a Kiddush sponsored by the Irgun." This may seem a small matter, ladies and gentlemen, but it is not. The link to the past must impact and even define the present. A Jewish state ashamed of its ancestors, of its heritage, unwilling to reflect it in its culture and public life, is not a truly Jewish state, not truly in communion with those who have come before. Begin never sought a strictly Orthodox state that forced people to observe Jewish laws in their lives or that forced people to eat gefilte fish. But he did seek cultural communion. The one who has most lyrically described this aspect of Begin's life is Yehuda Avner, a very religious Jew who served several prime ministers, but ultimately in Begin found a kindred spirit. Begin, Avner tells us in his book, was not totally observant in his private life, but he believed very strongly that Shabbat was the glory of the Jewish heritage. Thus, when Sadat offered to come to Israel on Saturday, a huge moment that Israel had been awaiting for decades, Begin insisted that he not come till Saturday night, late enough so that preparations could begin after Shabbat. And in the Knesset he explained, he said, quote, "I wanted the whole world to know that ours is a Jewish state which honors the Sabbath day. I read again those eternal biblical verses, honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and was deeply moved by their meaning." These words echo one of the most sanctified ideas in the history of mankind. We ask all nations to respect our day of rest. They will do so, Begin said, only if we respect it ourselves. And as Avner further describes, one of the greatest fights that took place politically for Begin in the early 80s was when he insisted that El Al not fly on Shabbat. After threats were issued by the unions of El Al, he said as follows, "Let me say this to you, the good workers of El Al. The government has been the objects of threats from some of you if we go ahead with our decision. We disregard these threats. We cannot engage in profit and loss calculations when it comes to the eternal heritage of the Jewish people. There is no way of assessing the religious, national, social, historical, and ethical values of the Sabbath day by the yardstick of financial loss and gain." And he concluded, "One need not be pious to accept the cherished principle of Shabbat. One merely needs to be a proud Jew." No other prime minister before him could make this case. And here, too, one finds the source of Begin's valuing of religious life and tradition in Brisk. One finds it in a Jew who was able to pray as Yisrael Sassover, to be called to the Torah as Yisrael Sassover, because he had done so in Brisk as Menachem ben Ze'ev Dov. Hart Haston, an intimate of Begin, recalls being in the prime minister's office as 7 members of the Haredi political party stormed in angry about something or the other. Begin sat silently as they yelled, and then, as they paused to catch their breath, he placidly looked at them and replied in Yiddish, "Nu, Rabboisai, hat schon gedaven mincha? Gentlemen, did you already say the afternoon prayers?" Stunned, they said, "No." So Begin, with Haston and his chief of staff, Yechiel Kadishai, formed a minyan, a quorum with their fellow Jews, whose rage by that point had dissipated. Begin knew how to daven, he knew how to pray, and he understood its power. And it was the prayers that he said in Brisk that he would never forget. And he recalled them when he made the case that we lose our understanding of what preserved the Jewish link to the Holy Land throughout the ages if we do not understand what it meant to pray 3 times a day to return to the Holy Land. In his 1972 eulogy, marking the annihilation of the Jews of Brisk by the Nazis, Begin spoke about the great synagogue of Brisk, the great synagogue of my great-great-grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. He described a school chum of his, Ariela Prager, son of the town Shochet, the slaughterer, to whom he would bring his family's kaparot, the chickens, before Yom Kippur. Again, these are references that no other Israeli prime minister could make. According to Begin, Ariela sang in the choir of the great synagogue with an angelic voice, or as he said, Hayalo kol hakarui alt. He had a voice that was an alto. Ad hayom, until this day, Begin said, Ani shomea et kol hatfilah shelo, o et tfilat kolo. I remember even now the voice of his prayer, or rather, said Begin, the prayer of his voice. And then Begin added the following about the synagogue, about its walls, about his father, and about all those within it. Uvitzaharei Yom HaKippurim, lo rabim od nisharu betoch kotlei Beit HaKnesset. On the afternoon of Yom Kippur, not many remained in the walls of the synagogue. Aval eila shenisharu oskim ba'avoda. But those who remained were reciting the avoda, the description of the service in the temple on the holiest of days. Va'aba tovea b'mafkia shedavka b'ha'avoda yesh li sha'er v'litpalel. But my father demanded of me that specifically here I was obligated to stay and pray Ku'ulai zohi akdosha b'chol ha'tfilot shel hakadosh b'chol yimot hashana, because this was perhaps the holiest prayer that would be said. And Begin remembered v'kolo shel hachazan mistalsel yachad im hashorim. Begin remembered how the cantor's voice merged with the choir as they described the sacred words of the prayer. V'kohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim b'azara kashayu shomim et Hashem ha'nechbad v'hanora hayu korim u'mishtachavim v'omrim baruch shem kavod malchuto li'olam va'ed. And the priests in the temple, when they heard the high priest say the Almighty's ineffable name, would fall and bow on their face. Ariela sang those words, Begin recalled, and those assembled sang it, and he himself sang it. Ki'ilu hi tmol shalshom, as if what took place in the temple happened only yesterday. Herein lies the secret of Jerusalem as it lived in Begin's heart, and how it lives, Begin understood, in the heart of us all. Begin himself, paraphrasing Shai Agnon, commented that Brisk nachon mishom banu, from Brisk we came, aval noladnu b'Yerushalayim, but we were spiritually born in Jerusalem. Or to put it slightly differently, it was because Begin was raised in Brisk that he was born in Yerushalayim. Because in that synagogue in Brisk were to be found Jews who were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, so many others, standing together with their feet in Brisk but their souls in Jerusalem, saying with loyalty and longing the words of the avoda v'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. And standing among them, looking upon his own father with so much love, praying with so much devotion, remembering a Jerusalem that once was and would be again, was a little boy who would one day become prime minister of his people, and would never forget where he once stood. And he would remind his countrymen again and again in his public life that honoring Zionism and its achievements means honoring those he had loved and lost. Because, as he himself said, the central lesson of his childhood from Brisk was, lucky is he who carries the yoke of his childhood with him. Begin, concluding his own eulogy for his family and for his murdered brethren, put it this way: Nizkoret avatam kasher zachinu l'shichror Eretz Yisrael v'legulat Yerushalayim. We remember our ancestors' love as we have merited the freedom of the land of Israel and the redemption of Jerusalem. V'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara, and the priests and the people who stood in the courtyard of the temple. Ze beruchenu hodot lavotenu, hodot lavatam et Eretz Yisrael. This is in our spirit, gratitude to our fathers, gratitude to their love of the land of Israel, gratitude for their prayers, gratitude to their faith in the coming of the Messiah. Hem lo zachu, he said, they did not merit to see redemption. B'neihem achareihem et atchalta du gula kovshu. but their children after them were able to acquire at least the dawn of deliverance. V'kach, he said, and thus, with Ahavat Yisrael, with love of Israel, and with love for our forefathers, Na'aleh nishmotehem b'kedusha v'tahara, we will raise their souls in holiness and purity. V'nasi b'libotenu et zecher avatam midor ledor, and we will carry in our hearts the memory of their love from generation to generation. This then, ladies and gentlemen, is the essence of covenantal Zionism. 3 lessons that Begin said he learned in Brisk. Love the Jewish people, do not fear the Gentiles, and above all, blessed is the boy, and fortunate is the man, who bears the yoke of his childhood with him. Begin's eulogy for Brisk reminds us of Israel's unique responsibility today to act to secure the safety of the Jewish people, but also to preserve the vision of those who had come before, those who had died before there was an Israel to protect them. If Israel fails to do so, not just to protect Jews, but to preserve the vision of the past, if for Israel the 2,000 years of persecution is merely a reminder that Jews need protection and nothing more, then the debt to the past is unpaid. But if the past vision is allowed to live, then those who died live as well. Today, for all of our manifold miracles, nevertheless, in a Jewish world that remains divided, we look again for a Jewish leader who can, in his or her own way, embrace the vision of Jabotinsky while still speaking with love and longing of Jerusalem, of past, present, and future. V'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. But there is, in the culture of Israel, something that gives me great hope. George Will once commented that even as America has a Washington Memorial, a Jefferson Memorial, a Mount Rushmore monument, but nothing for Alexander Hamilton, he said, if you want to see a monument for Hamilton in America, you just look around you. Because he said, in his vision in America has triumphed. Whether this is true or not, the truth is that while there may be no adequate memorial for the Altalena, it is Begin's vision that ultimately lives in the Israel that exists today. We have in Israel a culture which is as much Sephardic as Ashkenazic, a culture that is very much a union of the two, a culture and a people and a country that is much more religious than most of Israel's early founders could have ever imagined. More than 40 years after a political rally, more than 40 years after an entertainer at a political rally referred to Mizrahi Sephardic Jews as riffraff, more than 70 years after Ben Gurion ordered the Altalena fired upon, more than 9 decades since a young boy sat next to his father on Yom Kippur in the synagogue in Brisk. In Israel today, one can find a Sephardic singer by the name of Yishai Ribo, one of the most famous entertainers in the land, singing in both clubs in Tel Aviv and to Haredi audiences. And his most popular song, the song that he has taught all Israel to sing, are the words of the Avoda, V'hakohanim v'ha'am ha'omdim ba'azara. One can see Menachem Begin's Israel, an Israel I believe that he helped found. And so I look back to Yisrael Halprin, Yisrael Sassover, Begin's many aliases, Begin himself as Yisrael being called to the Torah and being asked by the sexton his name. And then I think with shivers of awe what unfolds as his alias Yisrael is given, and the unsuspecting sexton says the words traditionally used to call up a man by the name of Yisrael to the Torah, but also, unintendedly, describing the rise of a state and of a figure who would lead that state. He would have said, Ya'amod Yisrael, arise, O Israel. So may it continue to rise, and may not only Israel but all Yehudim prove worthy of the legacy that Menachem Begin has given us.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I can tell you that after learning all about this iconic figure, Menachem Begin of blessed memory, that he certainly is one of my Jewish heroes. And we have to share the message of his life and legacy with all of our children, our grandchildren, with our friends. As Ariela said at the beginning of this session, Chodesh Tov, and God bless you all.